Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to this Seatrade Maritime Virtual Conference sponsored by Abu Dhabi Ports.
Imagination, the one thing that inspires the way we do business, the reason behind our every success. Here, on the shoreline of Abu Dhabi, proudly stands Abu Dhabi Ports, steering the future of maritime trade and logistics. On its long journey to become an integral hub for global trade and logistics, Abu Dhabi Ports has achieved many major milestones. Today, it manages and operates 11 ports and terminals in the UAE and Guinea, and is rapidly expanding in order to grow its international presence, successfully creating world-class integrated ports and services, including owning and operating leading industrial hubs in the Middle East, creating and enabling digitalization of trade, building agile logistical solutions, providing world-class maritime services, and maritime training courses for more than a decade now. Abu Dhabi Ports aims to continuously promote Abu Dhabi as the #1 global trade hub. With collaboration and strategies at their core, Abu Dhabi Ports is reimagining the future of maritime trading at the global stage. Reimagining the future of global trade and logistics together.
To introduce our panel and guide us through the next 60 minutes of discussion, please welcome your moderator for this session, Seatrade Maritime News Editor, Marcus Hand.
Good morning, or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Marcus Hand, the editor of Seatrade Maritime News, and I'll be your moderator for this session. Welcome to day 3 of the Seatrade Maritime Middle East Virtual Conference. We've covered a lot of ground over the last 2 days, from the road to recovery, the energy transition, and digitalization. This morning, we have assembled an expert panel to discuss all the important issues around ports and the supply chain. This conference session, Building Long-Term Supply Chain Resilience, is sponsored by Abu Dhabi Ports and brought to you by Seatrade Maritime News. The importance, just to introduce this a little bit, the importance of the supply chain is something that all of us in the industry know well and understand. But most consumers who benefit from it simply just take it for granted. This year, as the world plunged into the COVID-19 pandemic, its role and need to keep functioning in even the most difficult circumstances became more widely apparent. It is a huge credit to the sector that it kept working seamlessly, even when large parts of the world were locked down, and the supply chain ensured that essential supplies, medicines, and food kept flowing around the globe to the billions of people who needed them. As we adapt to the new normal and look to the post-pandemic era as vaccines are starting to roll out, how has the supply chain sector been able to cope with the challenges of this year? And what lessons will it take from this? And what lessons will it take from this as we move into a world that is bound to be different from the one we are used to? We will be discussing these issues, the issues around this, with our eminent panel today. And I would like to encourage all of you to get involved with questions and comments, which you can submit via the chat box. Before we move into the panel discussion, I would like to introduce Dr. Noura Al-Daheri, Head of Digitalization Cluster and Chief Executive Officer for Makta Gateway Abu Dhabi Ports, who will be giving a keynote address. Dr. Noura Al-Daheri strategically manages Abu Dhabi Ports Digital Cluster. Under her stewardship, Abu Dhabi Ports Digital Cluster plays an integral role in the region's digital transformation efforts by enhancing stakeholder experiences and discovering new technologies that create cost and time savings in addition to generating revenues. Widely acclaimed for her contributions to the maritime sector, she has won numerous accolades, including the Entrepreneur of the Year by International Bulk Journal in 2018, the Seatrade Maritime Awards Integration for Women in Maritime Sector Award, the Seatrade Award for Young Personality of the Year in 2019, as well as the Emirates Women Award for Leadership. Her leadership has also been acknowledged by the International Association of Ports and Harbours at the World's Ports Sustainability Awards in 2019. I can't think of anybody better qualified to speak to us on this topic, and I'd like to hand over the virtual floor to Dr. Noura Al-Dahari. Thank you.
Thank you. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. It has been a challenging year by all means. The lockdown, the augmented supply chain demands, and the increased needs for having optimized processes to ensure a continuous operation and smooth flow of essential goods. As we approach the beginning of the end of an unprecedented pandemic, global logistic players and those involved in the international trade can now assess how our industry is set to emerge from this unique and complex challenge. Here in Abu Dhabi, significant achievement has been done. From the start of this year crisis, Abu Dhabi Port's robust business continuity strategy ensured we continued the flow of goods. So our nation's shelf remained stocked and hospitals secured the medical supplies they needed. In parallel, we called on the world's maritime sector to stand in solidarity with the communities around the world battling the coronavirus pandemic by our Horn of Hope initiative. Each evening last April, in a World First campaign, all ships in the harbors around the world sounded their horns for 15 seconds at sunset to recognize and support of the maritime, healthcare, and the critical sectors personnel working in mission critical roles to address the impact of COVID-19. We can all testify to how our supply chain adjusted to the new demand patterns and logistical hurdles, and how in its wake, transformation and resilience emerged as a front and center to ensure trade links continued as before. We have witnessed how in recent years, global supply chains are continuing to migrate away from the analog model of the past to the more digitalized tomorrow. We know that technologies such as blockchain, AI, and IoT have becoming increasingly popular. Their tremendous capabilities potentially allow us to introduce high level of operational efficiencies and competitive advantage. But while the motivation behind the adoption of these technologies have largely centered on efficiency and saving costs, the events of the past year have forced many organizations to embrace digitalization for the sake of business continuity. 2020 has demonstrated that what is required by companies to endure is a strong business model backed by a robust digital infrastructure and processes that can react swiftly to evolving circumstances as they happen. It is evident how our world has already changed and how we have quickly all adapted. As we all know, for one to succeed in managing a business, a focus on reducing complexity, risk, and uncertainty is a must. Only by enabling transparency across the entire value chain and providing visibility all the way from product origin to the customer can this be achieved. As we ready ourselves for the post-pandemic phase, the trade and the logistic industry can be confident of what lies ahead with the digital tools and technologies at our disposal. From our side, Maqta Gateway, the digital arm of Abu Dhabi Port, has always focused in developing innovative solutions, such as the single window, which we believe will play a vital role in managing supply chain processes and facilitating the global trade. And with the 15% of the value of the world trade lost to delays in border crossing, it is no wonder how trade facilitation via the concept of the single window has taken a hold around the world. We recently also unveiled our Advanced Trade and Logistics Platform, ATLP, in May 2020, a new platform that is rapidly transforming how trade via sea, land, air, and within industrial and free zone in Abu Dhabi is being conducted. When we consider the World Economic Forum estimate that up to 20% of the 9 trillion worth of goods shipped annually is spent in administrations alone, digital can unlock a new era by changing and modernizing how we can do business, providing stakeholders involved across the entire value chain with improved transparency. The new platform will enable users to not only monitor movement across their supply chain, but also allows them to better optimize resource management. Being part of the Hub Consortium of Abu Dhabi, we are now set for a new bright stage of mitigating the pandemic, focusing mainly on flawless transportation for the vaccine around the world. I look forward for today's panel discussion and hope the dialogue and the exchange will be enlightening and beneficial. And I hope that all of you who are hearing me now and your loved ones staying safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Noura Al-Dahiri. I think that was very positive to start this with. And looking at, quite amazing the figures you said about how much of global trade is just spent on administration and that side of things, and how we can use digitalization to improve these processes and hopefully reduce some of those costs and make everything more efficient. So I now would like to move on and introduce our expert panel who are taking us through today's topic and answering questions that I'm sure the audience will have. I'd just like to briefly introduce each panelist. We have there in the middle, Robert Sutton, head of Abu Dhabi Ports Logistics Cluster for Abu Dhabi Ports. Morning, Robert. And then we have on the right, Edward Tarr, Chief Executive of Saudi Global Ports. Good morning, Robert. And on the left side, we have Jonathan Beard, Partner, Infrastructure Advisory, Strategy and Transactions, Asia Pacific Platform for Ernst & Young Transactions Limited. Good afternoon, Robert.
Hi, Marcus.
Jonathan, sorry.
Greetings. Sorry, greetings from Hong Kong.
Yeah. Just to explain, I'm going to be asking each panelist an opening question in turn, and they could also, if they'd like, take a chance to introduce themselves a bit more and what they do. And following those three questions, as I said, we'll be taking questions from the audience as well, so please submit your questions via the chat box, as we'd like this session to be as interactive as possible. Now, firstly, I would like to come to Jonathan. Jonathan, could you tell us a bit about the trends you've seen in the ports and supply chain sector in the Middle East during 2020? Jonathan.
Great. Thank you, Marcus, and a pleasure being here. I'll come on to some of the issues that Dr. Noura mentioned around digitalization and smart ports in a second. But I wanted to start by putting it in the context of what's happening in terms of demand, both cyclically and structurally. Obviously, all ports across the world, including within the Middle East region, have been subjected to some fairly severe demand shocks. But it's been quite a different pattern to one we saw in the global financial crisis, where we saw both consumption and demand for manufacturers and services decline and then rebound very quickly. What we've seen through this COVID-induced pandemic is actually an initial decline in demand for actually manufacturing and tangible goods, but actually that has come roaring back and has been relatively buoyant. What's remained depressed, of course, has been services and demand for services. And that's really going to feed into the sort of recovery we hope to see next year, where we'll probably expect those economies that are very exposed and dependent to services, particularly tourism, and you might think of some of the UAE economies here, are probably going to see a very, very strong rebound. Some of the other economies that are very heavily dependent on exports, probably less so, but conversely, because they suffered less of a downturn during the pandemic. I think what this has meant for ports is not only initial reductions in demand, but actually probably greater fluctuation. So there's been some major challenges for both shipping lines and ports and terminal operators in addressing this. And we've seen this not only in terms of full containers, but a big challenge in terms of how we handle empty containers, and particularly recycling empty containers to the export locations, primarily in Asia. If you look at the container availability index here in Shanghai, for example, Marcus, it's an incredibly low level. It's well below the 0.5 figure that is the surplus deficit balance. And that's been exacerbated by the fact that there's been equipment shortages anyway. The production of containers in the first half of this year is 40% below what it was in 2019. Then when you factor in the challenge of recycling many of those empty boxes that have been stranded at import locations back to Asia, you can understand the challenge. Further, we've had increased requirements around inspection, checking of empty containers, and in many depots, a shortage of migrant labour and labour in general to facilitate that movement. What we've also seen from a supply chain side is, of course, increased, almost accelerated growth in e-commerce. People stuck at home, increased purchase of e-commerce, and that's had a knock-on effect for containers as well, because in many locations, those warehouses that would be fulfilling that e-commerce demand are overloaded. And a number of the big e-commerce operators have actually been making use of containers at ports as effectively as temporary storage capacity. So I think that's been a huge challenge for ports. I also just want to add something in the context of how supply chains might restructure. There's been an ongoing debate even before COVID about whether we were going to see more nearshoring and reshoring, partly because of political concerns, but also because of developments such as Industry 4.0. That means through advanced robotics, some of the unit costs of productions in typically high cost locations match those in lower cost locations, even in textiles. And then we saw certain interesting case studies because of COVID-19, where you saw manufacturers in the US using digital printing to produce ventilators, which traditionally would have been imported from other locations. Now, the problem's been that while those are interesting case studies, they're actually not that significant in the grand scheme of things, and not that significant when you place it against the huge manufacturing production capability in China and Asia, and actually the amazing quality of it, which continues to be upgraded, and I'll come to that. But if you look at China's share of exports, it peaked at 15% in 2016. It then went into a slow decline. It's now come roaring back, and actually, if you look at the last 6 months, the 12-month rolling average shows China back to 15-16%, and Asia has also increased. So the hypothesis of reshoring, nearshoring, while very interesting, we haven't actually seen it. And if anything, actually, it seems unlikely that it's going to be significantly changed going forward. And that has huge impacts for the Europe-Asia trade. It has huge impacts for those ports within the Middle East mediating that. The last thing I'll say, because I realize I'm, as ever, running up into my time limit, is around what COVID-19 has meant for automation and digitization. And Dr. Nora touched on this. I think what it has highlighted is that for those terminals that are fully automated, or let's put it this way, less fully dependent on labor, perhaps they've been in a better position to adjust their capacity flexibly, but more importantly, they've been less exposed to the health and safety risks that COVID has necessitated. Not only in terms of their stevedore workforce, but think of the knock-on impacts. If you have a vessel coming in, there's a crew change. We've seen circumstances where certain terminals have had walkouts from the stevedores because of concerns over health and safety. So if anything, COVID-19 has highlighted the advantages that greater automation can bring, and it seems likely it might accelerate that trend, while noting that many terminal operators and ports are stressed financially, so they may have limited space to invest in the short term. I think the other thing, though, that undoubtedly has been supercharged by COVID, and I think the Middle East has 2 or 3 ports that are exemplars of this, is the move to digitizing port ecosystems. So not just the automation within the terminal, but the role that the port plays in the wider supply chain ecosystem. And those huge inefficiencies that Dr. Nora mentioned around trade inefficiencies, but also health inefficiencies, because we have human-to-human agencies, paper-based transactions, that actually are probably getting more attention now during COVID-19. And I think I'll just conclude by saying I think that's a really interesting area for many of the terminal operators. They've always been very aware that their performance is heavily dependent on things that take place outside the gate. But you're seeing more and more locations where terminal operators are actively working with other participants in the ecosystem to see how they can better bring those parties together to accelerate the movement of trade, but actually make those port ecosystems more resilient. And I'll leave it there, Marcus. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Covered a lot of ground there, actually. I think there's some very interesting points to come back to. I think particularly that last part on the ecosystem is something that I'm probably going to come back to with the other speakers as well. I'd like to move on now to Robert Sutton from Abu Dhabi Ports, and I'd like to ask him how Abu Dhabi Ports has adapted its operations and systems to keep the supply chain running during the challenges that we've had this year. Robert, please.
Okay, let's try that again. So just by way of introduction, Robert Sutton, I'm the head of the logistics division for Abu Dhabi Ports. Interesting panel, interesting discussion. This is obviously a hot topic right now. 2020, without doubt, provided a number of surprises and challenges and opportunities, probably in equal amounts. We believe that crisis is a trigger for innovation, and that's certainly proven to be the case in Abu Dhabi Ports, where the things that we'd planned to do in 2022 were brought forward. The way we planned to operate in 2020 was in some ways put on the sidelines, and we responded to the crisis in a number of ways. So let's understand the impact first of all. So the impact is that trade lanes are disrupted. The impact is there's a stagnation of inventory in the supply chain, which impacts ports and the throughput of ports, and the ecosystem that supports that. Because ports are not generally designed to hold static inventory. So this was kind of a wake-up call for a number of the areas of the ports ecosystem in terms of the infrastructure to static inventory. We managed to work around that in a number of ways. If we look at the infrastructure which was underutilized due to COVID, so large exhibition centres, F&B places, where there's large infrastructure designed to hold large volumes of people, or material, or inventory, we could repurpose those. And that's what we actually did. We repurposed a large number of government and non-government facilities to support the increased stock holding of inventory, whether it's strategic food supplies or medical supplies, in order to provide some relief to the ports. So that was one of the initiatives. The other things we did, we recognised the demand for specific products in the healthcare industry. So hand sanitizer and factories. We, over a period of 5 days, repurposed a number of facilities to create mini production sites in strategic areas around Abu Dhabi to support the community. Then we looked at the demand for e-commerce, and Jonathan referred to this. It's a very, very good point. People were driven to online channels, not through choice, but because of necessity. So the online channels found themselves in a time of accelerated growth with diminished resources in some areas. So one of the things that we did very early on is we worked with the retailers to understand how we could support that. And we retrained and we set up a picking area in the cruise terminal of Abu Dhabi Ports, which was a picking training area for singles in retail environment. And then we retrained people that had been laid off from the tourism sector, from the food and hospitality sector, so they're able to go into the retail stores and serve this unprecedented demand. So that's one of the areas where, even as a ports company, we reach out, we understand how the sectors need to be supported, and we repurpose assets and provided people with the opportunity to learn new skills and add value to the community. So that was some of the kind of opportunities which came out of the crisis. The crisis isn't over. We're working through this. As Abu Dhabi Ports, we're working very closely with the Hub Consortium. One of the initiatives that we undertook right at the beginning of the pandemic was to invest in coastal capability in and around the port area, which has now provided us with a cold store facility licensed by the Department of Health, which can handle over 120 million vaccines of static capacity at any point in time. And this supports both the ports and the airports to make sure that we're geared to support and drive the COVID vaccination programs. So these are some of the areas where Abu Dhabi Ports has stepped up, and we've appreciated our partners supporting this. It's very important, and we continue to work with our partners to drive these things. Happy to take
Thank you,
questions.
Robert. Thanks, Robert. Yeah, we will. Plenty of things to come back to there on that. Obviously, a huge amount of effort has gone into repurposing things and changing the way you work just in a very short time frame this year. It's really interesting to hear about that. I'd like to move now to Edward Tarr from Saudi Global Ports. I'm basically going to ask Edward exactly the same question I asked Robert, and that is, how has Saudi Global Ports adapted its operations and systems to keep the supply chain running smoothly during the challenges of 2020? Edward, please.
Assalamu alaikum and greetings from Saudi Arabia. Thank you for having me today, and thank you for the question. The pandemic had a deep and broad-based impacts across economies over a long period during the year. Logistics players needed to be resilient to ensure availability of resources such as medical and food supplies. And SGP was no different, and I'm glad to share that we were able to operate close to business as usual throughout 2020 due to our focus on 4 key areas. Firstly, advanced preparations for similar crises have been developed as part of our overall enterprise risk management. This meant that we were able to implement business continuity procedures quickly, such as split team arrangements, stockpiling of inventories, protective equipment, medical supplies had all been activated on the onset of the crisis. Secondly, we received strong support from PSA Group. And by the way, Saudi Global Ports is one of the subsidiaries of PSA International, based in headquartered in Singapore. And we received strong support from PSA Group in sharing the best practices and resources, especially in setting up the global COVID-19 task force to monitor the pandemic situation and harmonize all safety procedures across its business unit. And PSA has a group pandemic management plan to guide and manage the response, covering crisis management escalation, emergency responses, and business continuity measures in order to minimize disruption to our provision of services. And to prevent and alleviate potential stress created by this new working arrangement during the COVID period, PSA has designed an in-house program called Fishball to address issues of mental health as well as wellness of our employees. Thirdly, a detailed planning is critical to ensure no areas, however small, were left out. For example, ahead of the lockdowns, SGP had quickly expanded the number of accommodations, segregated its workforce, and organized delivery of food supplies and provisions in order to minimize potential cases of infection across the team. Last but not least, SGP's strong partnership with its stakeholders, in particular with the relevant authorities and customers, such as shipping lines, consignees, and shippers. And this has enabled us to provide quick and clear communications and support for alternative supply chain solutions, such as the case when the land borders were closed to both passenger and cargo traffic. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. Good to hear some of the things that that the terminal's been doing in terms of safety and the community as well, and not all just business. Thank you. I think that's really helped to set the scene for the discussions that we're going to have now. And please do ask some questions in the audience. So I want this to be as interactive as possible. I'd just like to come back to Robert, just sort of what you were sharing about how you repurposed facilities and things like that across this year. How much of that has now gone back to, shall we say, normal, and how much are you kind of moving forward? You obviously got the new, the cold storage facilities for vaccines. So where are you at in this process now?
So thank you, Marcus. We are still using those facilities. We found a shift from food supplies, which was the initial use, more into medical and healthcare support as vaccination centres are being set up, etc. So whilst we're still using probably 80% of the facilities we repurposed, the purpose that we're using them for does change with the phase of the COVID program that we're going through.
Okay. So it's an ongoing repurposing and changing.
Yeah. I guess in 2021, Marcus, just to close that, in 2021, as we move towards a state of normality, then the conference centres will go back to hosting conferences, etc. But for now, it's business as usual.
Yeah. Okay. That's good to know. I'm going to come back to a point that Jonathan talked a bit about, which was, he was talking about how the surge in volumes that we've seen on certain trades, the shortage of containers and so forth. And I'd like to ask both, I'll start with Edward and then Robert, what you're seeing in terms of the Middle East, in terms of what's happening with the trades at the moment and the impact of shortage of containers, surge in volumes, and how you're handling that from the point of view of your ports. Edward, if I can ask you that first.
Thank you for the question again. I'm glad to update that the SGP team has responded positively to such development. And this year has been a very special year for us due to the assumption of management of both container terminals in Dammam. And we have experienced, prior to this consolidation on 1st of October, a growth of more than 20% for the first 3 quarters of 2020. With roughly about the same manpower as 2019. And to share, as recent as 17 September, we have handled a record volume on a single vessel that was close to 18,000 TEUs, which is also the record for Eastern Province in Saudi Arabia, while maintaining high productivity levels. So to answer that question, Saudi is probably a very unique place where we do see a very strong volume growth. And when we dive further and breaking down this volume growth, we notice that interestingly, the import volume or import laden has contributed significantly to this increase. And there are quite a few theories to explain why is that so. One of it that I hear a lot is because of the lockdown. Everyone is confined in the kingdom and they couldn't travel overseas, so the consumption has gone up. We have also heard theories where, due to the optimism of the vaccines and, warehouses are trying to fill up their space right now, and they are making, advanced purchases. That's possible in my opinion as well. But this shortage of import containers has certainly created a major concern for us as port operator, and we are trying what we could do in order to improve that turnaround time, such that the shipping lines, our main customers, they are able to receive back those empty containers as quickly as possible, and try to increase that turnaround. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Edward. It's quite interesting to see about that. So, increase in volumes you're seeing on the imports, and the concept of, it still amazes me, the concept of handling 18,000 containers and all the planning that must go into that on a sort of a single vessel call. Robert, could I ask the same question of you in terms of what you're seeing in Abu Dhabi?
Sure. So I think within Abu Dhabi ports, we're continuing to see expansion, investment in the port area. Our target is 9.1 million TEUs by 2024, and the leadership are investing in the ports, expansion of the port facilities to be able to handle that. I think what we've seen over the COVID period is a continuing investment in infrastructure to support the volume throughput, and we are seeing healthy volumes come through the port. Some of that volume may dwell longer than in past trading seasons, but certainly the volumes that are being handled are very strong. We've taken more of a holistic view, and I think part of the challenge and part of the solution is to look at this holistically. So it's not just about how we handle the container at the port, it's how we handle the vessels coming in, the transshipment of the containers, the movement of inventory to warehouses. To respond to that, we've adopted double trailer movements across a large number of areas of the ports, which allows us to move tandem trailers. So 2 to 4 containers at a time instead of a single move. We've continued to invest in, with our partner Macta Gateway, digital solutions to optimize processes and to move product through at a much faster rate. So that's some of the areas that we've been focusing on.
Okay, thanks, Robert. That's so it's good to know that expansion is continuing through what's obviously been for many industries a very difficult year, and how you're handling some of the sort of increases in volume and the changes in the amount of time that spends at the port, the dwell time. I'd just like to come to Jonathan. Bit of a crystal ball question for you. The current situation we're seeing with the shortage of containers and so forth, how long do you think we're going to take to work through this? Is this going to be just like a couple of months, or is this going to be quite a long-term issue for the industry?
I suppose what constitutes long-term in the industry, but no, I don't see it being resolved in the next 1 or 2 months. But I think once you get the other side of Chinese New Year, you'll start seeing things improve. I think the interesting aspect with all these changes we experienced during COVID-19 is disentangling those which are cyclical, i.e. we go back to business as usual, and those which are structural. As Robert said, that there's a growth in e-commerce anyway, but that's been supercharged by COVID-19. Does it knock it onto a new way, a permanent new, or do we come back slightly to some of the old way of doing things? And I think that's always quite a challenge and an interesting area for those working in the logistics and supply chain area.
Just to actually follow up on that, I mean, that specific example of e-commerce, is this like a sort of shift, a sort of wholesale shift that is going to stay the way it is, or is retail going to go back more to normal and people going to the shopping mall kind of thing?
I'm probably going to occupy a typically British position and be halfway. It's not going to go back to what it was before, but some of it will reverse to that direction. I mean, it's analogous to the working from home. I think we all thought it was, and in many industries you can't, but those of us who are lucky to have that choice, initially I think 5 days a week was wonderful, but now people are thinking, actually, I wouldn't mind actually doing a couple of days in the office. So it's sort of shift past and then come back to a new normal, but there's no doubt that there are going to be fundamental changes.
Okay. Yeah. Actually, that analogy with working from home, I think, is probably quite a good one, and how people have sort of felt about that. I just want to come back to something that was touched on before, which was digitizing the port ecosystem. The tendency, I think, of the sort of the container port and shipping lines that kind of exist in their own little bubble, and then things aren't necessarily that well connected in this industry, or as well, particularly in terms of the processes. I'd like to come to Robert. What are you seeing in terms of in Abu Dhabi in terms of digitizing that whole ecosystem that's around the port?
Thank you, Marcus. Well, I mean, we're quite fortunate in a way that we have a specific focused team on digitalization led by Dr. Nora. So we're constantly challenged both internally and externally to leverage technology to make sure that we're digitalizing wherever possible. And again, I think the key to this is taking a holistic view rather than digitalizing a single process or a single piece of the supply chain. It's more understanding of how do you leverage technology and digitalization so it has a wider impact across the entire ecosystem. And if you look at the work that Dr. Noor and her team have been doing, they very much focus on the holistic view and then bring that back down to the specific elements within it. So it's almost a reverse engineering of the issue. To bring that to a more practical level, we've moved completely from our bookings are all digitalized now. So our vehicles are tracked before they go to collect a container. The terminal operators are alerted to the vehicle arrival time. All the messaging happens whilst the vehicle is en route. So it's very, very clear throughout that each stage of that journey that there's a digital driver behind each of these processes. So we've seen digitalization take quite a lot of time and some risk out of the supply chain, particularly in terms of port operations. And we continue to move away from a lot of the manual processes. We've extended that now into the security of cargo. So we have an e-seal program, which allows us to geofence a container movement between the port and its destination, and also digitally lock and unlock that container through customs. So that's a couple of examples of how digital has really enabled the ports and the logistics providers to behave and act differently.
Okay, so it's interesting to hear the sort of developments that you've got there with that in Abu Dhabi. I'm going to sort of just put the same question to Edward, and also you're part of a much larger global ports group as well, as you mentioned, PSA, and what you're seeing in Saudi and perhaps the wider group that you work with in terms of digitizing that ecosystem.
I certainly agree with Robert. I mean, there are opportunities to increase penetration of digitalization in port and supply chain activities than what we have in Dammam Port today. And very frankly, I think technology has matured sufficiently for communications across platforms, and to encourage adoption. Stakeholders needs to be assured of a secured and reliable communications. And part of this resistance may be psychological. And in this regard, one of the positive outcomes from the current pandemic is the adoption of digital business activities, and such as the webinar that we are having today. Beyond the port, there are also providers who are working on solutions to orchestrate the flow of physical information and financial flow to facilitate global trade and cargo movement. And PSA is one of such service provider through our platform called Calista. It is an initialism for cargo logistics, inventory streamlining, and trade aggregation. I would say that enabling fully digitalized cross-border transactions is certainly more complicated, and it requires data harmonization and handshakes across jurisdictions.
Okay, thank you, Edward. I was going to take a question here from the audience, which kind of follows on from this whole the digitalization and e-commerce. It's a question from Fazal Boy, and he asks, with the increased reliance on e-commerce and the ecosystem of ports, we have begun to rely less on people and paper. And he's asking, how does this trend continue post the COVID crisis? Will less people be needed in the industry forever? Is this going to be a trend? I'll ask the question to Robert.
It's a great question, first and foremost, so thank you for asking that. It depends on the geography. So let's have a look at the drivers for automation, digitalization. Some of that is cost, some of that is the real estate, the investment costs. So I don't think there's a single answer to cover every geography. In the low cost markets, there could be a continued use of resources and deployment of resources to support demand. In some of the higher cost markets, then we could see more investment in digitalization and automation. If you look at a number of the markets as examples, if you look at the UK, much of the e-commerce is automated. Much of the order fulfillment is driven in large scale warehouses through a hub and spoke network, and that seems to be the trend, certainly in the UK and the more kind of cost driven markets. So I don't think there's a single answer. I think there'll be a balance between cost of the investment and cost of the fulfillment will be the key to answering that question.
So it very much depends on geography and the cost base that you're operating from in terms of labour.
Correct.
Jonathan, you've probably got a bit more of a global view than perhaps the rest of the panel. How would you see that in terms of different regions? Would you see some regions being more digitalizing more and less labour dependent?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo Robert's point, both in terms of, I mean, traditionally we've seen automation in the container space being pushed in Europe and particularly in North America, where labour has been traditionally very expensive and actually productivity has not been that good. One of the challenges we have, say, here in a Hong Kong or a Singapore, and this would relate not just to ports, it would relate to air cargo facilities as well, is until the crisis we had full employment and actually there was a struggle to find people who would want to work in these sectors. So automation was appealing in that respect as well. In terms of whether sort of COVID accelerates it or slows it down, I think initially there's probably a way that COVID might actually slow this process. Take, for example, the trucking industry in the US. Clearly, at some point, we'll go to a world of connected autonomous vehicles. And obviously, there's a strong case that actually, if you did that, you'd have much more resilient supply chains and some of the health and safety risks we've seen around human agency in the supply chain would go. But politically, if you're in the US or another economy where you've seen unemployment go up 7-8%, you're not going to introduce a drive for full automation when you're worried about unemployment figures. So geography plays a factor, but also the timing and consideration of political implications. I think you can see that the drive is clear, and as Robert said, depending on certain locations, certain political considerations, it will accelerate or decelerate, and that would depend also on certain types of the supply chain and what's the resiliency or ability to fight against those changes.
Okay, so we are again depending on geography and area, and we are still going to have a use for people by the sounds of it as well.
Yes, but it's a when, not an if question. It's going to happen, but it's going to happen at different times and different extents depending on the geography.
Just to come to Edward, in terms of that, what do you see in Saudi? What's the trend there?
I think it's pretty similar, and even prior to the pandemic, we have already seen acceleration in terms of some of this digitalization activities and all that, and of course due to the pandemic, this has further accelerated. So I think on that regard, we are no different from other regions across the world.
Okay, thanks, Edward. Just it sort of relates to something that came up in a session yesterday. This was looking at actual shipping and the fact that you've got so many different platforms in shipping for digitalization. Effectively, I think the comment was you've got 60,000 ships and 60,000 different platforms. I was just wondering for the ports and supply chain ecosystem. I'll start with Jonathan. Are there too many platforms at the moment? Is there a single way of digitalizing this ecosystem and getting everybody to talk to each other?
Yeah, good. I mean, good question. There's clearly an issue around standardization, and that if we can agree common standards, that would improve interoperability. On the other hand, it's true to say that the technologies that we now have, and Edward mentioned this, the maturity of those technologies actually gives you much more scope to deal with certain differences in standards or harmonization. It's also fair to say that as ever, there's a political agenda here, that certain trading blocs would like to set certain standards, whether you're looking at the US, Europe, or China. And it's no surprise here that the central government has put a huge focus on adoption of blockchain, partly to improve the resilience of its supply chains. And it was doing that before COVID-19 as a way to say to the world, look, you can have extended supply chains because not only are our costs competitive, the quality of what we're providing into logistics is the best, but also in terms of setting standards. So you saw recently here the first clearance or declaration of a container here in Shanghai through blockchain with Tesla as a party. So also there's an agenda there as well. But that issue of standardization is very important, even when you accept that the technologies we have available now give us much more flexibility and scope to do that.
Okay, so it remains something that needs to be worked on. And it's interesting what you said about the different trading blocks and the sort of political dimension to this. I'm going to sort of follow this with another question from the audience, which I think kind of relates, was asking about the cooperation between ports. And I think this was specifically, in the question was about Bangladesh and Abu Dhabi, but I think just more broadly, are we seeing more cooperation amongst the ports as you look towards this sort of digitized future? I'll ask Robert.
Thanks, Marcus. The short answer is yes. Yes, we are, and I think it's no longer by choice. It's a necessity, and the necessity is driven by the optimization of the supply chain. I think the customers are looking for that kind of connectivity, and they're looking for collaboration. Now, each port will have its own competitive advantage and its own positioning in the market, but certainly on behalf of Abu Dhabi Ports, we're very open for business. We are a very collaborative organisation, and we see this as necessity.
Okay, that's good to hear. And Edward, obviously you're joint venture and part of a larger global group as well. How do you see this in terms of collaborating with other ports?
My personal assessment is that such investment or such a collaboration, it indicates the desire by the operator to fill in the void left by the shipping line, in particular to facilitate the connectivity required in a hub and spoke arrangement. In particular, the trend of a larger vessel that is limiting the number of port that the vessels can call. In SGP, we do face the same challenges. Our preference right now is to concentrate in being the best or one of the best terminal operator in the market, and at the same time to collaborate with our direct customers for now, in order to develop, for example, feedering activity in Dammam Port. And we may consider to deepen such partnership depending on the market requirements and, of course, subject to our shareholders' permit to expand our business activities.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting to get that perspective from yourselves in Saudi. I'm going to come to another question from the audience here. This question comes from Gary Howard. I'm going to initially address it to Jonathan. Although it kind of touches on the fact that both Robert and Edward talked about expansion of their facilities. And the question is, are financiers on board with the acceleration in investment in port infrastructure? And are there any signs that the pandemic has affected this risk appetite? Jonathan?
I'm going to sound like a broken record, but again, it also partly depends on geography, Marcus. We certainly see plenty evidence of greenfield developments coming to the market and there being strong interest, provided the growth dynamics, but also provided the public sector for its side is delivering on what it needs to do to make a successful PPP. Obviously, in the Middle East, if we were looking at Saudi, we see obviously under the Vision 2030 initiative, a keen desire to introduce more private sector expertise and capital into transport infrastructure, including the port sector. And again, I think in all instances where those deals are structured appropriately, that there will be appetite from the from private sector finance and financiers. I mean, other locations, no. In other locations, you'll see ports easing back on their expansion plans. In some locations where ports have been operating at sort of 100% capacity and almost over capacity, COVID has given them a bit of a breather and a chance to bring forward some upgrade plans without interruption to service quality or disruption. So I'd say, Marcus, yes, there's still the appetite there. There's a long proven track record of private sector capital coming into the market, but it will vary by geography, what are the local demand conditions, and it also always varies by the quality of, in any PPP, the public sector. The public sector has to deliver on what it's going to do to make it an attractive proposition.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. I don't know if either Robert or Edward, you have a view on this, or you'd like to say anything?
Yeah, I'd just add to what Jonathan touched on there. I think it's we've seen no pushback on investment, certainly in the port infrastructure, in both the hard assets and also the softer assets. The digital side, certainly, we continue to invest in. We still see tremendous interest in supporting those investments from external stakeholders.
That's good to hear that that financing is there and the appetite remains, both for the physical and softer infrastructure. Conscious we're coming up on time here, really. I'm just going to quickly ask both Edward and Robert. Just a very quick question. You just sort of answer this in like 60 seconds or something. What do you see as a sort of number one priority for your customers as we head into 2021? Edward, I'll start with you.
I think ultimately our main customers, the shipping lines, they are looking for cost leadership. So beyond pricing, they are also looking at values such as productivity and reliability, which will have an indirect impact on their costs, for example, on fuel burn.
Okay. And Robert, if I can ask you the same question.
Yes, certainly. I actually think resilience is high up on the agenda of all our customers. They want a resilient partner. They want a partner that innovates, and through that resilience and innovation, they'll be able to protect their cost and their market. I think that's what they're looking for.
Great, thank you. I think that rather nicely rounds us into what the title of this session was, which was building long-term supply chain resilience. And I'm sure that is something we're all hoping we'll see as we move into 2021, and we see how the various developments come with the world economy, as hopefully we do get towards a sort of post-pandemic era. Lots of some fascinating discussion today around digitalization and how that's going to impact the port sector, and also some of the shorter term aspects we're seeing going on at the moment with the trade, shortage of containers, surge in volumes, and that sort of longer impact of e-commerce. We could probably go on for easily another hour, but unfortunately we don't have that time. So I would just like to thank our sponsors, Abu Dhabi Ports, and I would like to thank Dr. Noura Al-Dahiri, Robert Sutton, Jonathan Beard, and Edward Tarr for their fantastic contributions today. And we really appreciate your time and expertise on today's topic. I'd also like to thank everybody in the audience, and we appreciate your attention and participation. One more thing, please remember to come back for the final conference session, which is on the extremely important topic of welfare and training and people sustainability at 2 p.m. Dubai time. Look forward to seeing you at that, and thank you very much.